The silence of the Eastern Front in January was never truly empty. It was a heavy, physical weight that pressed against the eardrums until they throbbed. To a soldier crouched in a shallow scrape of frozen earth near Rzhev or Stalingrad, the world had shrunk to the width of a trench and the length of a bayonet. The air did not just carry the cold, it carried the metallic tang of gun oil, the acidic bite of cheap Mahorka tobacco, and the persistent, cloying scent of unwashed wool. When the wind died down, the stillness became terrifying. It was in these moments of absolute quiet, between the thunder of Katyusha rockets and the scream of Stuka dive bombers, that the true psychological toll of the war took root. Men listened to the ice cracking in their own canteens. They tracked the rhythmic, labored breathing of a comrade 3 feet away, wondering if the next exhale would be his last. This is not a story of grand strategies or red lines on a map. This is a reconstruction of the sensory isolation, the biting grit, and the haunting stillness that defined the most brutal theater of human conflict. The mercury had long since retreated into the bulb of the thermometer, leaving the German Sixth Army to contend with a temperature that turned diesel into jelly and skin into gauze. Corporal Hans Weber didn't feel his toes anymore. That was the danger. In the Russian winter, pain was a luxury because it meant the nerves were still firing. Silence here was a predator. It sat in the snow-dusted ruins of a grain elevator, waiting for a man to lose focus. Hans clutched his Kar 98K, the frozen steel of the bolt action stinging even through his frayed woolen gloves. He tried to remember the heat of a kitchen in Munich, the smell of roasting pork, and the humid weight of a summer afternoon. But those memories felt like fiction now. The sky was a bruised shade of violet, hanging low over the Volga. There was no birdsong. The birds had either died or fled weeks ago. Occasionally, the distant, dull thump of a mortar would disturb the air, but the sound was swallowed almost instantly by the vast, flat emptiness of the steppe. To Hans, the silence felt like a physical barrier. It isolated him from the man in the foxhole 10 yards to his left. They were two ghosts in a white wasteland, connected only by the shared fear of the Siberian snipers who thrived in this stillness. Those marksmen didn't need a barrage to kill you. They needed 1 second of your impatience, 1 puff of breath visible in the stagnant air. He pulled his scarf higher, the fabric stiff with the frozen moisture of his own respiration. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and exhausting. Shoveling snow to create a parapet felt like moving mountains. The hunger was a constant gnawing companion, a sharp ache in the gut that made the head light and the vision swim. He looked at his hands. The knuckles were cracked and bleeding, the fissures filled with black engine grease and dirt. There was no water to wash with. Every drop was needed for coffee that tasted like burnt acorns. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed from the tree line. It wasn't a shot. It was a branch, snapping under the weight of the hoarfrost. Hans didn't move, but his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. That was the trick the Eastern Front played on the mind. The silence amplified every tiny vibration, turning a falling icicle into a death knell. You lived in a state of hyper-vigilance that eroded the soul. You waited for a whistle, a shout, or the clatter of a T-34 tank engine. But for hours, there was only the wind. It hissed through the dry stalks of sunflowers, poking through the snow, a dry, skeletal sound that whispered of graveyards. Hans closed his eyes for a second, then snapped them open. Sleep was the final stage of freezing. He couldn't afford the comfort of the dark. He had to stay in the gray, in the cold, and in the terrifying, watchful silence of the front. On the other side of the no-man's land, Private Nikolai Volkov lay flat against the cellar floor of a shattered apartment block. The ceiling had collapsed days ago, leaving him a jagged window to the stars. Unlike the Germans, Nikolai felt the silence was an ally. It was the cloak that allowed his scouts to crawl through the rubble with knives between their teeth. He watched the flicker of a distant German campfire, a tiny, defiant orange spark in a world of blue and white. He knew that fire meant the enemy was desperate. A fire was a target. The air in the cellar smelled of pulverized brick dust and old lime. It was a dry, choking scent that coated the back of his throat. Nikolai adjusted the strap of his PPS H-41 submachine gun. The wooden stock was cold against his cheek, but the metal was wrapped in strips of burlap to prevent it from gleaming in the moonlight. He took a bite of a frozen crust of black bread, letting it melt in his mouth before trying to chew. The silence here was different than in the open fields. In the city of Stalingrad, the silence was jagged. It was filled with the ghosts of 1,000 domestic lives, a broken doll under a pile of soot, a piano with its strings snapped and curling like dead vines. He heard the faint clink of a mess tin from the German lines. It was a tiny sound, barely audible, yet it felt as loud as a gunshot in the vacuum of the night. Nikolai marveled at how his senses had sharpened. He could distinguish the crunch of snow under a felt Valenki boot from the crunch under a leather German jackboot. The leather was harder, more brittle. The silence taught you the language of survival. If you didn't learn it, you became part of the landscape. Another frozen statue for the spring thaw to claim. His sergeant, a man with a face like scarred leather, gestured toward the ruins across the street. No words were spoken. In the silence of the Eastern Front, a hand signal was a symphony. They moved like shadows, their white camouflage smocks blending into the drifts. The only sound was the rhythmic shush of their legs cutting through the powder. Nikolai felt the adrenaline spike, a hot surge that momentarily defied the sub-zero temperatures. The silence was about to break. He knew the pattern. First, the tension would become unbearable, like a taut wire vibrating at a frequency only the dying could hear. Then, the screaming would begin. The "Ura-hema" his comrades and the frantic chatter of MG-42s. But for now, there was only the frost. It grew on the iron railings in delicate, fern-like patterns. It covered the faces of the dead, turning them into marble monuments. Nikolai looked up at the moon, a cold, indifferent eye, watching the slaughter below. He realized then that the silence wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the absence of humanity. The world had become a void of ice and iron, where the only thing that mattered was the next breath, the next inch of ground, and the terrible lingering quiet that followed a flare's dying light. By February, the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of anticipation, but the silence of exhaustion. The great pocket had closed, and the air was thick with the smell of surrender, a mix of gangrene, wood smoke, and the sour odor of defeat. Thousands of men were marching into the white abyss of the interior, their footsteps a dull, rhythmic thud on the packed snow. There were no victory marches here, no cheering crowds, just the endless, winding column of the hollow-eyed, moving through a landscape that seemed to have no beginning and no end. The silence of the march was the most haunting of all. When a man fell, he didn't usually scream. He simply sat down. He would look at the snow with a strange, detached curiosity, as if he were looking at a soft bed. The column would move past him, the silence closing in like water over a sinking stone. There was no energy left for mourning. The living were too busy negotiating with their own lungs for one more gasp of frigid air. The guards, their breath blooming in thick clouds, watched with stony indifference. The war had moved on, leaving this trail of broken humanity to be swallowed by the Russian winter. In the abandoned villages along the route, the silence was absolute. The chimneys didn't smoke. The wells were choked with ice. A single shutter banging against a window frame in the wind sounded like a rhythmic percussion, a heartbeat for a dead town. An AI reconstruction of this scene would capture the precise frequency of that banging wood, the way the sound waves bounce off the hard-packed snow. It would map the texture of the frost on a discarded helmet, each crystal a jagged diamond of frozen history. But it is the human element that remains the most difficult to simulate, the specific, crushing weight of a silence that signifies the end of hope. The Eastern Front was a theater of superlatives, the largest battles, the most casualties, the cruelest conditions. Yet the survivors rarely spoke of the statistics. They spoke of the quiet. They spoke of the way the world seemed to stop moving at 3 in the morning when the temperature hit -40. They remembered the sound of their own eyelashes clicking together as they froze. This silence was a scar on the collective memory of a generation. It was a reminder that beneath the roar of the engines and the fury of the guns, war is fundamentally a lonely experience. As the sun sets on the reconstructed landscape of the past, the shadows stretch long and blue across the drifts. The tanks are rusted hulks, the trenches are shallow depressions in the earth, and the men are long since gone. But the silence remains. It is a haunting, evocative presence that lingers in the archives and the soil. It tells a story that words often fail to capture, a story of endurance, of terror, and of the terrifying beauty of a world turned to ice. The silence of the Eastern Front is not a void. It is a monument.